All right, everybody. Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Before we start, there is one little brief, very short thing I want to read to you. For you, if you remember last week when we were talking about Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi, Judah the Prince, talked about the fact that people could just see by his manner and his demeanor what type of an unbelievable holy person he was. He was also known, therefore, as Rabbeinu HaKadosh, our Rabbi, the Holy One. I mentioned that there have been people in our time who they just exuded this kind of holiness, and mentioned specifically Reb Moshe Feinstein Zatzal. And after the class, Harry Trapp sent me a message with a very brief story that Rochelle, his wife, was involved in, and I asked for permission to read it. It's just like a short paragraph, which just shows you, proving the point of what I was saying. He tells me as follows. Rochelle was the assistant chief of occupational therapy in New York Hospital during the 1980s. Walking down the hospital corridor one day, she saw Bachrim standing outside a room. The chart that said said Moses Feinstein, Rabbi, Staten Island. Rochelle questioned the Irish head nurse, Pat Caden, if the patient indeed inside is who she thinks it is, or who thinks it is. Pat replied, "Oh, the rabbi? He's been with us many times, and I tell my girls that if the Jews had a pope, he would be the pope." So, case in point, exactly what I was saying last week about Rabbeinu HaKadosh, that and also the idea, which we've talked in many other situations, of how we act also reflects on ourselves, our people, etc. And tremendous Kiddush Hashem. Okay, what I want to do tonight is I'm going to start off with a little bit of a list. This of what I plan to do between tonight, next week, and probably going to go into another week at least, because it's a relatively long topic. The first part will be shorter, and the second part will be much longer. We're going to talk a little bit more about Yehuda HaNassi and the Mishne that he edited. He didn't really author it per se; he edited it. We'll talk a little brief overview of the Mishnah, what it's made up of. This is not a class in Mishnah. It's not a class in Gemara or Talmud. So we're not going to get into depth of particular depth, but to be a little bit familiar with it, maybe more than you might be already. A very brief comment about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, which is kind of timely since there was a commission report today regarding their own disaster a few years ago. The growth of the Talmud in Israel, what life was like at that time, life in Babylonia, where the majority of Jews were at that time period, and the growth of the Babylonian Talmud. And we're going to compare and contrast, which for those of you who ever involved yourself in the English, teaching English as a subject, and especially here in Israel, you have concept of compare and contrast. We're going to do that with the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, versus the Talmud Yerushalmi, or the Talmud, it's in English called the Palestinian Talmud, or the Jerusalem Talmud. That's the general idea. We're not going to cover all this tonight. There's no way. But it's just what's coming up. So what we're going to do is going to go back to a slide we left off last time, and it said like this. The Beit HaMikdash has been destroyed. There was Bar Kochba revolt, and we're sitting now around the year 200 of the Common Era. So about 1800 years ago, a little over. And Jews had passed down until this point all the oral law was done exactly that. It was done verbally from parent to child, teacher to student, and there were notes. There were even the equivalent of Mishnayot, what we would call these Mishnayot, that were floating around. Nothing in an organized fashion, and unfortunately, there was a decline or diminution in the level of knowledge to be passed along. And Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi took this pasuk from Tehillim, "Et la'asot la'Hashem eferu toratecha," which loosely means that it's a time to do something for God. Your Torah is being forgotten, even though that's not exactly what it means. And it's been used as a catchphrase also when there's an emergency called an et la'asot. And what was this et la'asot? What was the emergency he saw? He said that it's time, after approximately 1,000 years, for me to write down and to edit that which has only been done verbally till now, which again is kind of a contradiction in terms, because he's going to write down the oral law. So now our oral law is in writing and our written law is in writing. And as I mentioned to you, at least on more than one occasion, this class and others, that one without the other is meaningless. Not useless, but meaningless, because we don't know from the Torah, as I said last week, we don't know how to build a sukkah, we don't know what tefillin are, We don't know what tzitzit are. We don't know how to keep Shabbat. What do you mean we don't know? Of course we know. It says in the Torah, right? It says all kinds of things we have to do. But what we know is the halacha now didn't start from the Torah itself. It's not in writing. It's all been left to until the year approximately 200. It's been left to verbal transmission. And he decides to write it down. And he decides to write it down in 6 sections. Now, we know that the Torah has 5. There's 5 books of the Torah, Chamisha, Chumshei Torah. And for various reasons, he decides to write down, to divide his into called Shisha, Sidrei Mishnah. I'll translate all this in a minute. But for those of you who've ever heard the word Shas, like he's learned Shas, that means Shisha Starim, all 6 sections of the Mishnah or the Gemara, which includes all of this. And he divides them into 6 sections. I'm going to spend only a brief time on this. And it goes as follows. The sections are as follows. Zra'im literally means seeds. And it has to do with brachot and all the mitzvot that have to do with the land of Israel. Whether it's Shemitah, Bikurim, Maser, Trumot, all these mitzvot that have to do with the land of Israel are in Zra'im. When we talk about the Talmud, we're going to see a massive difference between Bavli and Yerushalmi on how these are approached as far as the actual Gemara or Talmud that refers to these Mishnayot. Moed, holidays, Shabbat, Chagim, and things associated with that. Nashim literally means women. It has to do with marriage, divorce, vows, and other areas that have to do with these areas of halacha. Nizikin, the fancy English word is torts, not the kind you eat with an E at the end, but T-O-R-T, damages. When your ox gores another ox, because I don't think any of you have any oxen, but nowadays when it's your car, when it's your person, when your pipe bursts in your house and it damages somebody else's property, God forbid, and you didn't get a hold of my son-in-law fast enough, then nizikin, all these types of damages. It also deals with property law. It deals with things that one might find. Kodashim, holy things. What does that mean? It refers to mostly having to do with korbanot, the bringing of sacrifices in the time of the Beit HaMikdash. And the final one, Taharot, which is the most, I won't say obscure. That's where I'm holding right now. I'm learning Mishnayot for a cycle. I'm in Taharot right now. And part of it is extremely interesting, and part of it is unfortunately not. But that's the nature of learning something, that you're not going to be enthralled with every single thing you learn. And it has to do with Tuman Tahara, ritual purity and impurity. The time of the Beit HaMikdash, where they had to do with bugs, they had to do with dead bodies, had to do all kinds of wonderful subjects. If you take a look at the red letters, the highlight at the beginning of the word, each one of the Sidarim, it makes up 2 words, Zman Nakat. Zman means time. Nakat is Aramaic for to take. So Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi implanted, so to speak, in the words of the Shisha Sidarim, the 6 sections of the Mishnah, he implanted a message to all of us. Take the time. Take the time to do what? To learn. Because he was not expecting that what he wrote would be the end of it. He understood that what he wrote was only a beginning. And we're going to understand what that means in a couple of minutes. But it had to do to be a springboard for what comes next. And just a few little facts about Mishnah. There are 4,192 Mishnayot, which are made up of 525 chapters. The longest of the 6 is Taharot. And it takes just under a year and a half to learn at the pace of 1 parak a day. I want to just make a pitch for a minute about something. And I know this is a Jewish history class. You're not here for a lesson in learning Torah necessarily, but it's all part of the parcel. It goes with it. That's one of the reasons we learn Jewish history, to understand our history of Judaism and also how it impacts our daily lives in Torah as well. There are many, many things that people can do on a daily basis that may seem very small, but in the long run, you are able to accomplish a tremendous amount. Whether it's a Mishnah day, whether it's a parak of Tanakh a day, a Daf Yomi, a page of the Gemara every day, Halacha Yomi. There's just endless amounts of information out there in every possible language you would want to learn in. And it doesn't mean you're going to remember everything you learn, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't make the attempt. So I think that at some point, everyone should have to take upon themselves that every day that they're going to learn something that they can also conclude. Parshat Shavua is another one, but something that you can go through and know that you've gone through all of Mishne, you've gone through all of the Gemara, you've gone through all the Halacha, whatever it might be, whatever fits you, and doesn't have to be per day. You could do a Rambam, parak of the Rambam, take a week to do it, whatever it might be, but set yourself a goal. Okay. The time period we are talking about, which ends with Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi, Pachot Yoter, within about 20 years from now, about the year 220, it'll call the time the Tanaim. This time period have all the names of the people that you are familiar with that come from the Mishnah. They're in the Mishnah. The names are in there. And as we will see that the time periods of Jewish history break down in titles. No one started off after the Beit HaMikdash time and said, okay, we're going to start the time period of the Tanaim. It's going to last until the year 220. It doesn't work that way. It's like World War I. Before it started, no one said it's going to be World War I. It became the Great War. Then became World War I during World War II. No one knew that Six-Day War was going to be the Six-Day War. The Chavetz Chaim wasn't born the Chavetz Chaim. He was born Rabbi Yisrael Mer HaKohen. Actually, it wasn't Rabbi Yisrael. It was Yisrael Mer HaKohen from Radin. He became the Chavetz Chaim. So, people think like, oh, this is going to be the time of the Tanaim. They must have made a decision. There's no such thing. Okay, so we're in the time of the Tanaim. We're finishing that up now, where, again, we could spend hours talking about all the different personalities and the people Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shima, all these names that you hear bandied about. It's good to spend some time to learn a little bit more about some of these individuals. You do that through Pirkei Avot, which we have a class on. You could do it by just looking online. You could do it by learning and the Mishnayot, and you'll come across these names and learn about these people because they are people to whom we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude. So I think what we will take a look at, just one more comment, a little bit more of Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi before we move on to a couple other areas here, as I mentioned at the beginning. He lived in Beit Sha'arim. This is all up north. And the last 17 years of his life, he promulgated the Mishnah, mostly in Tzipori. Now, it's significant and important to understand that when we talk about the Talmud in a few minutes. So I'm just putting that there to see that little piece of information. He's buried in Beit Sha'arim. There's a custom, actually had a chance to do this twice, that when you go to Beit Sha'arim, and you're sitting above the area of his, not on his grave, but above the area, the hilltop above his grave, to learn Mishnah. After all, he's the one who edited the Mishnah. He also attempted to institute smicha only in Israel, which meant, we talked about last week, that the idea of the teacher putting his hands on his student, saying he was appropriately taught and instructed to, now he could be a teacher, he had the title of Rabbi or Rabbi. He wanted that only in Israel, but eventually it was not successful. It matter of fact, for very good reason, which we will see tonight, maybe, it then rolled into Bavel or Babylonia. He edited the Mishnah. Among editing the Mishnah, that also meant that he decided many cases that were in dispute. Now, for those of you who know Mishnah, you'll know that you'll say, like, what do you mean he decided? There's literally hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of disputes in the Mishnah. That's true. But there are plenty that are stated the halacha, what it is. And then when we talk about the Talmud in a few minutes, we'll see how that affects it. And where did he come up with deciding? How did he know what to decide? How is it that centuries later, the Rambam decided what the halacha was going to be? How did the Rabbi Yosef Karo, who authored the Shulchan Aruch, how did he know? Again, it's based on rulings that they got from their teachers and going back prior generations. Later, we'll see that when they codify Jewish law centuries later, it'll be based on choosing like 2 out of 3 rabbis who said one thing, that it would come to that conclusion, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. And Mishnah, we can say, it's a sentence I put together. I don't know if it's clear, but it's the clearest expression of Hashem's word of the oral law. What does that mean? That if we want to understand the first step of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law, this is it. This is the Mishnah, and that is what be the foundation for all future teachings, learning, halacha. Everything starts at the Mishnah. Okay. Just a couple of minutes on, not even a couple of minutes, on Shimon Bar Yochai. I'm going to jump ahead for a moment to the 1700s, just about a few hundred years ago. And we know that there was, in the 1700s, there was the American Revolution, there was the French Revolution, and there was the Jewish Revolution. What was the Jewish Revolution? And that was the birth of Chassidut, which we obviously will talk about much further down the road, of mysticism, of Chassidut. Chassidism was born. The Baal Shem Tov, the father of Chassidut. Also, this is all at the same time. You will see, if you're a student of history and as you become a student of history, that many things that happen at one time, there seems to be a domino effect of other things of the same nature happening. When there's a time of revolution, it's not just in one country, it tends to be in multiple places. And it happens in the Jewish world also. In this time period of the birth of the Mishnah, the writing down of the Torah Be'al Peh, there's another layer that we don't pay attention to often, and that is the birth of mysticism, mystical ideas within Judaism. Most people will point to the Zohar as being this time period. It's not agreed upon that Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, authored the Zohar. There are opinions that say that he authored it in a cave where he sat for 13 years with his son. Others have attributed to a later time. Doesn't make a difference to us right now. What we do want to understand, though, is that the birth of Jewish mysticism as being spread more than just by one person, but to others as well, has its beginnings at the same time period. So you're seeing that we've gone from having only Torah shebichtav as something in writing, having the Torah shebe'al peh just oral. Now it's in writing, and you also have the spread of mysticism through Shimon Bar Yochai. Now, before we get to the next time period, the time period of the Amoraim, a little bit of background, both in terms of what's happening in Israel, what's happening in Bavel, what's life like for them? What are they doing? And how did the Talmud even come about? So I'm going to start with that first question, answer it briefly, and then when we go back to the Talmud in a little bit, it'll be much, much broader answer. I'm going to give you a hypothetical halacha. I'm making it up as I go along. Every Tuesday in a month that has the letter Y, you have to take the bag from the bottom drawer of the desk, the blue bag, bring it to the park, stand up, and say, Am Yisrael Chai. Now, I didn't tell you why. I didn't tell you what park, what bag, what desk. I left a lot of details out. In a similar fashion, lahavdil, Mishnayot are written in a similar fashion. It gives us some basic general information and leaves a lot open still for verbal transmission. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi built in Torah shebe'al peh into the Torah shebichtav addition. What does that mean? Instead of laying out every single statement that every single Tana, the rabbi of that generation, said, he gave us some of the information. Some is said in a very unclear way, on purpose, so that people will say, what does this mean? And they'll have discussions. This will lead to the next 300 or 400 years of discussions, which will become the Talmud. We're going to come back to that. But understand, at this moment, there's more center of Torah and Jews learning and teaching, even though it's a very small community in Israel, more so in Israel at this point by the time of Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi than that is in Bavel. Much bigger difference. We will come to that. So the birth of what will become known in English as the Jerusalem Talmud, the Palestinian Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi, has its beginnings here. They are starting after the death of Yehuda HaNassi. The next generation or next time period is going to be called the Amoraim, and that will be what we know in the vernacular as the Gemara. Because the amount of people living in Israel at that time was smaller, and the amount of Torah scholars was small, the Talmud Yerushalmi never became completely edited, not necessarily completely finished, and kind of left certain things hanging. I'm not going to give you more information on the Talmud Yerushalmi until we learn about the Bavli, so we can make the comparisons. But what I do want to do is I do want to talk a little bit now about the community in Bavel. We're going to leave Israel. We're going to shift over to Bavel. But before we do that, let me show you. A couple pictures. This is modern day Iraq over here. Okay. And this is modern day Iran. And I will leave the political comments off right now. Iraq is where we're going to concentrate on, because Iraq is over here now. It was Babylonia, ancient Babylon. Now, this is really during the time period of Ezra and Nehemiah, but this is, for our purposes, this is fine. Let me just make this bigger. And you will see where Israel is. Here's Israel. The Jews are sent into exile through here, a couple other places. Not going to go through the whole history right now. And many end up here in Babylonia, i.e. Bavel, modern day Iraq. So here in Judea, in Israel, we have Jews throughout the country, not a lot. And over here, there are approximately 1 million Jews living in Bavel at this time, the time period I'm talking about now, around the middle of the 3rd century, the 200s. In addition to that, there's something that's going to happen in Bavel. We're going to take this off and come back to this slide in a few minutes. We want to talk about what's happening in Babylonia. Now, you would think that they were taken to Babylonia, that their lives were horrible, they were beaten, they were enslaved, which early on, after the destruction of Beit HaMikdash in 70, yes, that's what had happened. We are now about 200 plus years later, and things have changed over time. And by the time the Romans have succeeded in driving the Jewish community out of Israel, or not driving them out necessarily, but driving them into poverty and almost into obscurity, because things are getting bad, worse and worse in Israel, in spite of the fact that the promulgation of the Mishne and everything else. At that time, suddenly the Jewish community in Babylonia starts to flourish. The truth is that at that point, again, in the late 200s, the Jews of Bavel had very little to complain about as far as their daily lives. Their daily lives were actually pretty good. Their religious life needed work, and it was the early times of these Amoraim, the people who would then come to interpret the Mishnah and write the Gemara / Talmud. We'll understand soon the difference between or why those titles. But it is important to understand that it's not like, oh, they had all these great rabbis and scholars and Torah people learning in Israel, and all these great rabbis and scholars and Torah learners in Bavel, and everything's going crazy, and they're all like this. Wasn't like that. As it started to wane in Israel, it started to grow in Bavel. There were many things that happened to the Jews in Bavel that also could have caused the end of Babylonian Jewry, and which has been true for us over the centuries. Even when it's not us being directly attacked, that we will end up being the ones that suffer for political problems. For example, just a few years after the death of Rabbi HaNassi, there were a couple of tragedies that occurred in Babylonia, which at this point now becomes under the rule of a Persian king. They were the Persian king who came to power was a priest, also a priest worshiper of Zoroastrianism, which is a fire worshiping kind of a religion. I use the terms in quotes. They were very fanatical, and the Jews were seen obviously as an outlier, complete outlier from that whole area. And there was persecution in the country in general against people who were not from that faith, and of course against the Jewish people as well. But over a period of just a few years, and probably less than 50, even less than 30 years, 40 years, Jewish life began to return to normal as more normal kings became. Now, by the way, I could spend hours just talking about this. It's not worth the time on it right now. But also, in addition to that, in Babylonia, there was an invasion by the Romans, changed hands. There were all kinds of other problems that happened, and there was the destruction also of some of the Torah academies that started to grow in Babylonia. And some of the names of the Torah academies, some of you will know if you learn the Gemara, which we will get to shortly. I said that the Jews didn't have much to complain about, and not only did they not have a lot to complain about, they were also somewhat self-governing. What does that mean? there was a position that was held by an individual who had to have been a direct descendant of David HaMelech. He was called the Exilarch, Exilarch, Exilarch. In Aramaic, known in the Gemara, also you'll see it name mentioned many times, or the title, the Reish Geluta. Reish Geluta means the Rosh HaGalut, the head of the diaspora. It was seen as the titular head, the figure of the Jewish people in the diaspora. In this case, we meant Bavel, Babylonia. The Persian government recognized the Jews as a separate group and gave them this almost a form of autonomy. And since this person, the Exilarch or the Reish Geluta, had to be a direct descendant of David HaMelech, and they were the leaders of the Jewish people, because the office of the Reish Geluta lasted till approximately the year 1000, that means that we had a leadership of the house of David for almost 2000 years, which is incredible. They weren't kings, but someone from the house of David had the ability to be in charge of the Jewish people for approximately 2000 years. What is it that they could do? Said they were in charge. What did that mean? It didn't mean they can pull their Netflix subscription. That's not what it meant. They had the ability to appoint judges. They had the ability to excommunicate people. They had the ability to levy taxes to be used for within the Jewish community and also to give the government. He was an extremely influential political persona who left his mark on the Jewish people over the centuries. When you learn Gemara, and you'll see the references to the Reish Geluta, and you'll learn stories, and you'll see things that halachot that they said. It's amazing to see the power that this one individual had. In most cases, they were revered. They were seen as being the absolute authority and accepted as the absolute authority as well. What's also interesting, though, is that over centuries, Jews have had this opportunity, not from the descendants of the house of David, but other times of our history, when we've had good times and not such good times. Remember, even in World War II, even in the camps, there was some form of self-governance. We know that in the late Middle Ages, early, let's say 1600s and 1700s, there was something for about 400 years called the Va'ad Arba Aratzot, which was also a form of self-governing body that took multiple countries together in Europe that had also very specific duties. But this had more specifically to Bavel. It had to do also with ritual. It had to do with halacha. It had to do with taxes. This Reish Geluta was a very powerful, important individual. What was daily life like in Bavel? So the Jews were mostly agricultural, working in growing in fields, growing food. That's how they made most of their money. In addition to that, we have to remember, I try to show you the map, but it's not necessary right now, the Tigris and Euphrates River, right? For those of you who remember a little bit of world history, remember the Fertile Crescent, Nile Delta, all these words in the Tigris and Euphrates, which we see in Perek Aleph, very beginning of the Torah as well. The ability to grow things, the ability to do that, gave them this ability then to be self-sufficient, not only be self-sufficient, but they also raised cattle. They also had vineyards, and they did business, not just locally. They were also able to, because of some other trade routes, they were able to also do some trading, but most of the business they did was still in Babylonian Bavel. There were some manual laborers, of course. There were people who were weavers and whatever, and horse and blacksmiths. And that's important to know for another reason. In the Gemara, you'll find certain people with a title. They didn't have last names yet, of course, in history at that point, but they were identified sometimes as by their trade. You had someone who was Nafcha, who was a blacksmith, Sandlar, who was a shoemaker. Later, of course, in history, some of these people take on the names of their trade. We know that. Schneider is a tailor. But at this point, we know that the Jews, there was this concept that we have today of Jews sitting and learning in a kollel. Did not, this idea of the way we picture a yeshiva life, that didn't start until the 1700s. Kollelim even after that. There were academies in the land of Bavel. We're going to see the map on that in a minute. But what the purpose was for those academies was to interpret and understand the Mishnah. So we're going to come to that just in a second. But how did they live? What was their life? They had a regular Jewish day-to-day normative life, but they had the benefit of not being oppressed by their government. We'll see a few time periods in Jewish history, such as the Golden Age of Spain, time of the Rambam, when things are flourishing for the Jews, because, of course, until they got tossed out of the country. Their manner of living was not magnificent. They didn't have palatial homes, but they didn't live in squalor and poverty. They was not like a shtetl type of life that you might think of, but it had it was the world center of Torah learning. It was a world center of Jewry, and it was I would say the most extreme amount of writing and growth in Torah up to that point in Jewish history, which we're going to see now. We'll take a look at this one map, and you will see a number of cities. There's some of them which you may know: Neherda, Matamachasya, Sura, Mechoza, Shafnatziv, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. I'm pointing on my screen like you could see me point. That was smart. Over here, the Tigris and Euphrates. And there's names associated with all these academies. All of these academies, there's Sura and Pumbedita. Not all of them are here. Oh, here's Pumbedita over here. Funny names. They're Aramaic names of the language of the people of Bavel, a certain type of Aramaic. And these people, names that you may or may not know, you may remember hearing in the Gemara, you hear Rav and Shmuel. They always had differences of opinion on things. So here you see Rav was the Rosh Yeshiva in Surah, Shmuel in Neherda. You have famous ones all through here. And this is just a tiny amount of people who were the rabbis who sat to talk about and learn what was exactly the meaning behind all these Mishnayot that Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi wrote. So let's talk now about what this means. After the year 220, after Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi died, at the end of the Tanaim or Tanaic period finishes, moving into the Amoraim, the time period of the Amoraim, that lasts from about 220 approximately to approximately year 500. During that time, now I'm going to just talk about Bavel, go back to Israel in a minute. In Bavel, hundreds upon hundreds of rabbis and individuals learned Batei Midrash in these Torah academies that I just showed you on the screen, with a few purposes. One, to learn Torah, obviously. But what became bolet, most pronounced, was that they were now able to use something more than just the Chumash or Tanakh, rather. Now they could use the Mishnah that Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi had written down, and now is being passed down. Now we're already a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations later, and then many more. And they're sitting there with these books of what Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi edited, and they're having arguments and discussing, well, did he mean this? Did he mean that? Inkfa, we're talking about this topic. Let's talk about another topic. And over time, these discussions are recorded. This is not being recorded as a transcript, but it's being recorded to for the purpose of interpreting and understanding what the Mishnah means, so that the next generation and the next generation and the next generation understand what was being taught by Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi. Over the course of a few centuries, approximately a little less than 3, and again, I know I'm repeating myself, but it's important. Keep the focus. We're talking only right now in Bavel, until approximately the year 500. All these are being written down over time. What are the rabbis saying? How are they interpreting this Mishnah? How are they interpreting these stories? They're telling stories. They're telling myths. They're telling legends. They're telling us, teaching about astronomy. They're teaching about zoology. They're teaching about chemistry and science and medicine. And literally every single topic you can imagine is being discussed in the Beit Midrash, in these various Torah academies. Along come two people near the end of this time period called Ravina, Resh, Bet, Yud, Nun, Aleph. Ravina, it's one word, one name, and Rav Ashi. These two are credited with having finished the editing of the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. It is also known as the Gemara. I'm going to tell you why in a minute. And it's also known as the Yam HaTalmud, or the Sea of the Talmud, because everything you want, any topic you can think of, whether it's in vitro fertilization, whether it has to do with brain death, whether it has to do all these modern things that we talk about, already discussed in a different way, but it's already somehow referred to in the Gemara. All things you would maybe never think of eventually find their way back, and you find them in the Gemara. So it's the Yam HaTalmud, and also, like I said, all these different topics of science and math, and if you don't know, the Vilna Gaon wrote at least, if not more, at least one math book, because it said without understanding math, there's a lot of the Gemara you can't understand, which is very true, by the way, when it comes to, and also Mishnayot, and Seder Zeraim, math is important. In Sukkah, math is important. In other areas, math becomes very important. Bummer for me, Mr. Math Genius, not. In any case, why is it called Gemara? I just need to turn the contrast down here on my computer before the battery dies. There we go. Why is it called Gemara? So if you remember the story of Hillel HaZaken, the Hillel and Shammai, the famous story of the guy who wants to be converted while he's taught Torah while standing on one foot. The response to him was, "My desani lach, that which is anathema to you, v'chavrech lo tavid, don't do it to your friend. V'idach perushahi, and the rest of Torah is all commentary on this. Zil gemor, go and finish." Supposedly, this is the only theory I've actually personally only heard where the word Gemara comes from, is from that story. It says, Zil Gemor, go and finish, means that our goal is to try to continually add to this basis of the V'havta l'reacha kamocha, which is how he said it in the opposite. He said, what you don't want to do to you, don't do to somebody else. But the word Zil Gemor, go and finish. That's the Gemara. At the same time, switch over now for a moment to Israel. At the same time, less Jews, less rabbis are also trying to interpret the Mishnah. There is some cross-communication between the rabbis in Israel and the rabbis in Bavel. And we see it in the Gemara. It even talks about when so-and-so came from the west, i.e. he came from Bavel, from Israel to Bavel. So it happens that we do see this cross-communication. But for the most part, there are two Talmuds that are growing at the same time. One finishes earlier in Israel, finishes later Bavel, and they also have different characteristics, radically different. What I want to do next week, Bezrat Hashem, is I'm going to speak about and explain, and it's important. It's not just it's a matter of Jewish history. Part of our history is without the Gemara, we don't have modern day history. Is to understand the differences. From that, we'll also learn political differences that existed between Bavel and Israel, and how the Jews had to be careful with certain things in Israel and outside Israel. And that'll be borne out by some of the differences between the two Talmuds. Bezrat Hashem, we will continue next week on Wednesday again. Remember, in March, it's just going to be on Wednesdays at 7 o'clock. Look forward to seeing you all then. Have a great evening.